Shipman, Director of the Spencer S. Eccles Health Sciences Library here at the University of Utah. And today is our 2016 Mayden Lecture. And Pricilla Mayden was the first Director of the Library who served from 1967 to 1984. And this lectureship was placed when she retired in honor of her by her friends and colleagues. So we honor her today. And with that honor, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Iain Kerr. And I met Iain at a Venture Well conference on innovation about a year ago. And after hearing him, he totally busted my idea of what creativity was all about. So I immediately went up and I said, "Do you travel?" And he said, "Yes, I do, especially if you're asking me to come to Salt Lake City." So, so he read my mind, and he's going to transform the idea of what creativity is all about, and then also entertain questions at the end. But we do have a virtual audience, so I welcome you as well. And this is being recorded for later review in addition. So, Iain, I'll just not steal much more thunder and let them tell you. You can tell them who you are.
Okay. Thank you so
can
much.
Do that.
All right, it's great to be here. Thank you so much, Jean and the university. It was this morning we did a workshop, and a lot of the stuff I'm going to cover is similar. So if you guys leave, that's totally fine. If you stay, that's great too. So as Jean said, I want to really reframe how we think creativity. It's something I think that as we become more, as design, innovation, creativity play such a central role in our lives and in universities, it feels like we've got the models all wrong. And so I want to be slightly polemic, and it would be great if you guys want to play along and push back. These are experimental ideas, so while I say them in a kind of polemic way, they're speculations. So here's what I want to do. These are the myths I'd like to dispel. So that creativity is in your head, that there's such a thing as creative people whatsoever, that it's something you could have, that things work for us, like these chairs are our servants, that things have properties. So hopefully you're a little skeptical, because I think most of us imagine things actually have properties, right? Like that things have a purpose, and that the new, which is what creativity is all about, is actually something new. And then finally, this is something I've been thinking a lot these days, that when we talk about design, we really punt it to the end of the process of making. Like after engineers and whoever have figured everything out, then we'll bring in the designers and they'll make things look good. They'll gloss it up, so get some artists to help communicate an idea. So that's what I want to take on. So I'm not going to argue for the first part. Hopefully it just becomes self-evident by the end. But so I just want to say it's not in your head. It doesn't emerge out of thin air. And most importantly, it's creativity is a feature of reality itself. It's not a human thing, or it's not exclusively human. Everything around us is made, came into being, will disappear. Therefore, it's an act of creation, innovation, development. So we find it everywhere. And the really important part about that is nobody was involved in that. And both in the actual sense and the conceptual sense, your eyeballs are miraculous acts that have no agent behind them. They're quasi-random evolutionary events. And we want to champion how great our chair is as an act of design or innovation or creativity. Hands, fingers, lungs, eyes, toes, everything is an act of creation without a creator. And I think that should make us have to reframe a lot about creativity. So really fast, the definition I want to use for creativity is to get away from seeing it as a thing and just see it as a process. It's a process. And as processes, there's all sorts of procedures, there's techniques, there's systems you could use to do things or see. You could catalog them. This is where libraries really come in. You could have a resource database of these. And the difference between, say, creation and creativity, you could just say is that it's something genuinely new. And there's genuinely new things all the time, right? So the second thing, I just want to, this is like a basic to understand innovation. Like when we make things, we imagine we're making them to serve a purpose, like they'll do something for us. That is, I don't want this to sound wrong, but it's a really problematic viewpoint from the perspective that the things actually make us. So I want to turn to one of the most astonishing thinkers of things, which was Marshall McLuhan. And so he says, I just used my cell phone to take these photos, so I apologize. But he uses the word media to talk about objects. So he calls all objects, all tools, media. And he says, all media work us over completely. They're so pervasive in their personal, political, economic, aesthetic, psychological, moral, ethical, social consequences that they leave no part of us untouched, unaffected, and unaltered. Now, we can think of that of, like, say, really big transformations, but McLuhan wants us to believe that a chair does that to us. A pencil does that to us. Your glasses, your earrings. So he kind of uses as his paradigm example the alphabet and writing. And so he says, Western history was shaped for some 3,000 years by the introduction of the phonetic alphabet, a medium that depends solely on the eye for comprehension. And this is really important. We're totally a visual culture. McLuhan would argue it's simply because we moved from an oral culture to a literate culture. We talk about visual studies. We talk about knowledge and wisdom as light into darkness. All our key metaphors of understanding and meaning and truth are ones that are based in vision, in seeing, getting to the bottom of things, getting into things. So the alphabet is a construct of fragmented bits and parts, have no semantic meaning in themselves, that are strung together in a line, bead-like, in a prescribed order. Its use fostered and encouraged the habit of perceiving all environment in visual and spatial terms, particularly in terms of a space and time that are uniform, continuous, and connected. The sentence is a prime example. But that we, as the West, obsessed about breaking things down to their essence is an outcome of being an alphabetic society. That we want to find first atoms or genes, and then we want to break that down further, and we want to break that down further, and that we imagine when we get to the smallest unit, we've found meaning. McLuhan argues that that's an outcome of the alphabet. So the important thing to think of as a creator or designer is that we might shape our tools, but afterwards they shape us. We're really the outcome of these chairs and tables and grammars and languages and habits and practices. So the simple thing is change tools, you change people ontologically, I'd argue. All right, so first argument. The next one, to get a little more spurious, right? That one could sound plausible. Things don't have properties. No properties in things. So this is an example I used this morning, but our friend here is jumping into what? A wonderful property called liquid, right? Water has the property of liquidness, right? At room temperature, water's a liquid. Nobody would disagree with that. There's a property, right? So how could I say this? So if you imagine our friend goes up a little higher, he jumps into it. It's still a liquid. It's something that'll break his fall, slow it down. He'll have a great time. Now we send our friend a little higher. At crossing some kind of threshold, this will be water, but its qualities will be of a solid, right? So once you start thinking that, it should worry you as putting the property in something. Because is the property in that? So now, like in the Western tradition, then we say, well, there's two choices. It could be either objective or subjective. But the thing is, no matter how hard our friend thinks about it, he can't subjectively change. He can't make that whatever he wants. It is what it is. It's a solid as a quality. So a final example I want to use, and I think this is really helpful in terms of innovation. You change the body, you change the size. Water doesn't stay liquid or solid. A new quality emerges, which is of like a surface tension. And so now you have a new way of being in the world. So you could imagine you could innovate qualities and properties by changing bodies, habits, practices, entanglements. And if you go back to the question, then where is a quality? It's an emergent property of a system, which is to say liquidness or solidness isn't in anything, it's in the relation. And it's that we hold relations in a stable way that we always imagine it's a liquid. But you shift any of these factors differently, and different qualities will emerge. So creativity isn't just about mixing stuff up that exists in the world. You can actually make new properties and qualities emerge by changing, the embodied subject, make our arms longer, fingers longer, add technologies, new sensory systems. You change the objects we interact with, the practices. You're not doing something subjective or just making new objects. You're actually co-emerging entirely new environments with physiological properties. So to me, this is really astonishing, and it gives designers a huge actual space of play. So the qualities of the world are not fixed. Depending on who you are and what you're engaged with, water, we can say emerges as a liquid or a solid or even a surface or something else. It's an open-ended set of properties that could emerge. It's not a fixed list. Like water isn't a liquid, solid, gas, plasma, what have you. So these are, you could also call capacities, like the capacity of water to slow a fall, the capacity of water to break bones, the capacity of water to act as a tensile surface, is entirely relational and emergent. So you can't dig into something and go, I can find it in there. There's no in there. It's entirely relational. So what something is what it can do, which requires us to say in a context. So I think this is probably a lot of what I just said. So very important, this shifts how we teach creativity and we think about it. It's not something that relies on ideation or brainstorming. It really asks people to do things. You have to actually experiment in the world with stuff to figure out what could emerge. Before you even, in a sense, decide what your project is or how you're going to approach the final outcome, you have to do. And the new isn't something that you can already know, but you can imagine these qualities or properties simply don't exist till a body takes a form, meets an environment in a certain way. So they're ontologically or metaphysically unknowable. So you have to work from the middle. You have to work from action. You have to change bodies, environments, habits, tools to discover. And then as you discover things, you can try and stabilize them. As you stabilize them, you can start to follow them. You know, we see this, maybe like a good medical example is, you know, you can be born with perfect eyes. Your eyes can work. But if you don't move the body, you know the famous 2-cat experiment of Held and Hind, where they had one set of cats move through space, but their body didn't move after they were born in darkness, and the other set of cats walked. And the set of cats that just were moved around in space, they were entirely blind, because they didn't do this act of connecting habit, practice, body to environment to allow the emergence of sight. You see that a lot with people who are blind for one reason or another and are given sight. They don't see, you know, when you restore sight. That takes a lot of effort to actually produce sight. So again, this is, I think, critical, where we tend to separate ideation from experimentation. Like, we do a lot of brainstorming, we ask people what their problems are. But if you separate the two, it's a dead end. So the fundamental goal has to be not to solve a pre-existing problem, but to actually figure out how to make new possibilities emerge, and then, in a sense, solve or resolve those. All right. We were talking about T-Rexes last night. Did you know that the T-Rex, this isn't a furry creature, it's feathery. T-Rexes had feathers. Most dinosaurs were fluffy feathered beings. So I want to talk about Darwin's Nemesis. And so if you imagine from this idea that everything has a purpose, and, you know, design and innovation is about figuring out what somebody's problem is and solving it. So if we frame it that way and you go, well, what problem does flight solve? You know, and then the answer is things like you can escape getting eaten, you can get from A to B faster, all of these things, right? It's highly effective, fantastic thing. So Darwin got asked this really simple problem by this guy called Mivart after the first edition came out. And Mivart said, fantastic idea, so if every generation a creature's slightly different, you know, and it takes millions of years to evolve from one thing to another, how would something like the wing evolve? Because you could imagine after 2 million years, you've got a little stubby flap. Doesn't do much, it's a half-assed wing. So you got this useless appendage. And then after another 10 million years, you've got this thing, it doesn't quite fly, but it drags in the dust. It's almost there. And then finally, after 27 1/3 million years, you have a wing. So how could purpose, first of all, follow that? From, you know, like where somehow there's an intentionality, like, hey, we could get from A to B better if we suffer for 28 million years. And then the second thing is, like, how would we not just get eaten? So Darwin, this is like the one criticism he took so seriously that he actually wrote a long response to it. And so I don't want to tell you the answer right away. I want to walk you through what's really astonishing about it. So if we want to think about flight, we have to first think about how the feather emerged. And the feather didn't emerge for flight. The feather, this is a great question. Who knows why the feather first showed up? Anyone? Or what, I should say, what did it do? So the first feather is a byproduct of the scale. And as you guys all know, scales emerged to sequester toxins. You probably didn't, right? But I didn't either. So it turns out like things like our skeletal system first emerged, as cartilaginous structures to sequester toxins. Scales were another version. The way they formed, they could easily go into tubes, and the tubes could branch. And so the byproduct of sequestering toxins and making a tube, like the unintended consequences, I should say, of having a lot of tubes is that you can store warmth, right? So you can thermoregulate differently. It wasn't an intended thing, but so you have this, so dinosaurs, as they start to move and occupy new niches, having a better way of staying warm is great. The byproduct of being, having hollow filaments all over your body that bifurcate is that they could be filled with pigment. So the unintended consequences of that is you can look really good. So you have all sorts of astonishing forms of display emerge, which push feather size. And you get feathers like wherever they won't get worn off by movement, like on the spine, the crest, the back of the arms, as you can see here. This is enormous character, nothing to do with flight. So you see wings emerging, nothing to do with flying, but they have to do with like looking sexy. The unintended consequences of being really sexy are that when people try to eat you, they get a mouthful of feathers, right? So it pushes like bigger feathers. You can also scare people, right? So now it turns out there's this wonderful pivot that happens with wings, which is totally this wondrous unintended thing. So you could say the answer to Mevart is that wings evolved to keep eggs warm. Obviously, it also evolved for all the other things I said before. But it turns out, if you're a naked little dinosaur, you can keep a few eggs warm. But if you have nice big wings, you can keep quite a few eggs warm. So you have another engine driving wing size. So again, nothing to do with flight, right? Flight's irrelevant. Now we have famous Archaeopteryx. And you guys all instantly recognize her, right? That's our first mammalian relative. So mammals started to appear. We're trying to escape from the Archaeopteryx. So it turns out, well, now there's more debate, but first we thought this flew. And then it turned out it couldn't fly, like if you measured weight and wing and what have you. And now people think it might have been able to fly. But it turns out you have a lot of these creatures that look just like a bird that could not fly. And so then the question is like, what are they doing with these things? And so the environment is a really good clue. You start to go from giant ferns to trees. You start to have all these little mammals. It's also driving dinosaur size, so you get a lot more small dinosaurs. So it turns out what wings do really well is they weren't helping these creatures like flap and fly for short little distances, but they were helping them climb trees. Now it turns out that they're doing this in a counterintuitive way. They're not like flapping up to be lighter, but since, and this is exactly what we were talking about last night, is how like T-Rex has these tiny little arms. So if you have tiny arms and big back legs, you have no hope of climbing a tree. You just fall over backwards. So what the arms start to do is they push your back legs into the tree, so you can run sort of standing up. So what drives these large wing sizes and these strange, things that we call birds wasn't flapping or flying, but pushing into things. Now, naturally, once you get to the top of a tree, you're screwed, right? Because you got to get back down. And so it turns out these things first help, like what's the kind of pipeline of parachuting to gliding to flapping to flying. And the diversity of these is insane. You have four-winged birds, so these back legs, all sorts of things. So, we can come back to our question. And if we remember the question to Darwin, like how could you get a wing if you need it to somehow show up for 28 million years before it works? It turns out the wing did not evolve for flight, right? The wing evolved first to get rid of toxins, then to keep you warm, then to be sexy. So there's purpose is not fixed. Like your hands are not here to grasp things. Your eye isn't for sight. None of that's fixed. We imagine that everything evolves towards purpose, but everything actually evolves through purpose. It's keeping going. It's whatever it can do, whatever it affords. So the purpose of the wing, if you actually look today, penguins have fantastic wings, nothing to do with flight, and it turns out their feathers are even better. They have evolved to produce these bubbles. And these bubbles, you know how like penguins do that magic jump out of the water that just does not make any sense? It's because of these bubbles that it can break the surface tension. They've got this sheath of air around them that they're trapping. And so when the orca is about to bite them, they just pop right out. So you could say, the purpose of a wing is clearly to swim, and the purpose of feathers is to pop out of water. Hummingbirds. Do you guys know how hummingbirds sing? Anybody? They fly in patterns, and their wings are vibrating to make a song. So they fly like backwards and down, and then forwards and up and backwards and down. So they don't sing by chirping. So the wing's purpose is to make mating calls. There's the African black heron. This bird's nearly flightless. What its wings do is it provides, gets rid of glare so it can fish. So next time anyone asks you what a wing does, you know that flight is just one of the many trivial current aspects of it, right? But it never evolved for it. You can't equate purpose and thing. It's everything it could do. So I think as an innovator or creator, that is like a powerful thing, because you're no longer looking at stuff where you figure out what it is, but you're thinking, well, what could it do? And what else could it do? And what unintended consequences does having feathers give you? And what other unintended consequences? And you kind of can follow the sideways movement of unintended consequences. So, nothing evolved for its current purpose. Everything involves betrayal. Flight betrays land. You have to cross some threshold. Every object's agnostic to purpose, right? It's whatever you can do with it. Like you don't need to use your eyes for sight. It could turn out much better to do something else. The gentleman Daniel Kish, a blind fellow who sees through clicking. So it turns out like sight at that point, because it's coming in through sound, so he sees 360, up, down, around. He can see through things. So cognition shifts at that point, right, as sensation changes. So there's a lot of space of innovation there. So it's important to realize the wing didn't solve a pre-existing problem. It actually produced a new mode of being in the world. That mode of being had all sorts of problems attached to it, like how do you glide, fly, thermal lift, what have you. So the problems come after, but things are totally anti-utilitarian. So that's what matters, is you first make a way of being in the world, and then you solve its problems. So you can't know in advance how long something will take. It might be 26 million years before you have a good product. And you won't actually know what it is. You might think you're working on an egg warming device when you've invented flight. And usually innovators are like that. They think and they're certain they've made an egg warming device, and it takes somebody else to point out that they invented wings. And this happens all the time. We were talking about that. It's very hard to see what you've done. You fail into the new. You fail to be a good dinosaur by becoming a bird. You know, time is critical, like having lots of time, having collaborators, being able to change your identity. We're no longer working on eggs. Sorry, guys. I know you gave us millions of dollars to solve that one. We've come up with this kooky idea that you don't need to be on the ground. Nobody understands it because it doesn't pre-exist, but trust us, it's going to be really cool. It doesn't really fly well, literally and figuratively. I apologize for that. So the really important thing as spaces for innovation, we actually have to protect innovators from success. You know, we have to, in a way, protect people from making products to get to creativity. We have to allow them to betray what they're up to switch purpose. You know, you have to sort of like have, in a way, secret labs so that you can just do things that won't work. You see that all over. And in ways support that. And I think libraries and institutions are really good for that because they allow you to go sideways. Like if you're now no longer dealing with eggs, what's all the information to deal with, you know, thermodynamics and lift and whatever. You can just move sideways really fast with information systems. I like to call it we shouldn't be interested in pilot projects which are about prototyping where you've come up with a good idea, but we need things like pirate projects that just probe the world. You know, they betray what they're supposed to do. You've given up on the eggs and now you want to talk about flight, and then you give up on flight and you want to talk about the next thing. So keeping moving. The new doesn't need to discover anything new. You guys from the morning know this one well. Beautiful painting. If you guys don't recognize it, that's because this is Jackson Pollock before he was Jackson Pollock. This is when he was just another generic sort of post-war European painter, but in America. So now, the one thing I think is important to say that Pollock's really not an individual, and all of these stories we tell about innovators are as if they're usually one person. So it's really Pollock and Lee Krasner and a whole bunch of other people that this is a story about. But we don't have a beautiful clip of all of them at once. So we've got this mythology. But I want to show this to you anyway. This is Pollock. He's moved out of New York because he can't afford it. He can't afford to stretch his canvases. They're on the floor. Being on the floor changes so many things about what it means to paint. You're no longer like framing the world. You're thinking of it as a field. So just watch this one little section. So the question is, how many painters in the history of painting have dripped? The answer has to be every single one, right? And if you think about it, how many of us have dripped something? The answer also has to be all of us. But so Pollock is truly an innovator, but it's not because he discovered anything new or did anything new, but that he understood that a drip wasn't a drip. That he realized that a drip was a portal to rethinking painting. That a drip was a way to shift the paradigm of painting or of art making entirely. So the key isn't whether something's new. It just has to become a pathway. You have to treat whatever you're doing as some form of pathway. It's a doorway to a world that's unknown or unknowable. The key here is that you have to become entirely anti-American, which means we think of creativity as about leadership, it's these astonishing figures that lead, that do things. But it's really some guy who's dead broke, who's a total loser, who's just following a drip. It's the opposite of the heroic model of innovation, where you figured it out, there's a eureka moment, you envision how the world's going to change. This guy and Lee Krasner, they had no idea what they were doing in this sense, but they saw that drip was pulling them somewhere, drawing them forward. So this is where it's really useful to look at the work of Thomas Kuhn, historian of science, with the, we use the word paradigm now all the time, we're interested in revolution and paradigm change, but he actually offers us this super simple methodology to turn crap, like drips, into pathways. And, so this is what he says happens with a paradigm shift. But if you just read it sort of slightly against the grain, you have to treat that drip as producing a crisis. So it's like an act of, it's an action. It's like crisis making for whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be a drip. In our workshop this morning, we were just using dirt was good enough to produce a crisis in clothing design, or that rocks should be pushed into bodies. It could be anything, but you have to treat it this way, which is to say you have to trust it enough to follow it. It doesn't have to be true. You don't know that drip is going to lead you anywhere. There's no guarantee, but you treat it as if it will, and that makes it generative. And the important thing here is it's not an end in itself. That drip isn't even an important painting. It's not a painting. It's not a work of art. It's disappeared. It's gone. Nobody cares about it. It's what came after. And so that's the other thing, is you have to trust things that you'll exceed quickly, the grass and the dirt. That might not be what clothing is, but it'll lead you somewhere. So you have to make it unprecedented, and then it becomes open-ended, lots of new problems, joins unrelated fields. And this is where it gets really, I think, sticky for institutions, because we imagine bringing people together in advance of creativity. So we form the team at the beginning. But really, this is the point when the team needs to form. So you don't know in advance who you're going to need. So this morning we did a workshop and we looked at clothing and innovating around clothing. And you could, and I asked the question afterwards, at the beginning, who would you have invited to collaborate? And it would be seamstresses and sewing machines, and you'd get all sorts of different fabrics and people who could fit and drape and what have you. And you'd get software that could help you with all of that. But when we got to this moment in the process, we realized, one group was talking about genetically altering the body. Another, or like figuring out how stones or things could push in and out of the body across its threshold. Another group was trying to figure out how dirt and grass could sort of grow in the body or something. But it's only at that point that you could decide like who to invite, who needs to come in to collaborate. But more than that, like how do you make the space you need? So we want to sort of predict that all in advance and lay it all out, but I don't think it really can be done. So here's just keeping on going with these problems. Creativity doesn't solve anything. Like, so the wing doesn't solve something. It changes the ground rules. And you can't know if it's anything, if that drip's worth anything, till you put it to work. And at that point, you have to nurture it. But how we normally nurture things, like in our lean sort of launchpad methodologies, is we try to nurture it to product and to utility. But you can imagine if at the beginning of our dinosaur process we did that, and we're like, this is about sequestering toxins, like, fantastic, that's our problem, the body's got too much toxins, we'll just make even better scales, or whatever it might be. You'd never have led to any of this. So the moment you move things towards utility, or you do that too early, you're kind of screwed. It might be a good way to solve problems, and there's a lot of problems, I just want to say, that are worth solving that way. Like, you're hungry, just eat something. Everything doesn't have to be solved in a creative manner. Like, who really cares? Just grab a bite to eat. You're cold, put a coat on. But there's moments, like especially when we're talking about innovation as a practice, where we really should imagine that's what we're doing, that we're not merely in this kind of reductive way making a better widget that already exists. So you don't know who the team would be. And the last and really critical thing, the normal thing we call design, which is like making products and innovation, is what happens last. After you've figured out what the world is, then you can innovate, which is to say, once you've discovered flight, or you've fallen sideways into it, now you can make really cool birds, let's say. But not till that. The great thing is Pollock had no idea how astonishing his discovery was. He went on to make some really beautiful paintings, and so did Lee Krasner. But the idea, the underlying sort of paradigmatic idea that he co-evolved with, which was to think of art as action. And art as action went on to transform everything that came after. But you couldn't even like ascribe that to Pollock. It's like people like Alison Knowles at the end and Capro and others, they saw it in that work in a way that Pollock didn't. There's a whole school of Japanese action painters that realized how far you could take this thing and how it was a kind of embodied space of action and becoming, like Niki de Saint Phalle using she started like shooting at balloons and other things. And at that point, art changed. At this point, you had painting. At that point, you had an entirely new paradigm. So in some sense, Pollock didn't see how radical and how complete that paradigmatic change could be. And obviously, it's entirely open still. We could rethink it. So unlike IDEO and design thinking, you can't solve problems till you create them. So the idea that you can go out there, this is in terms of creativity. Obviously, you can just, as I said, solve problems. But you have to make them first. You have to figure out what's a problem worth having before you can solve it. And creativity is in that. So that's flight. That's action painting. It generates a world, not a solution. So we gotta drop the obsession at the end with that we're solving problems for customers and clients. Okay, next one. Here's part of the problem: is life is lived looking backwards. So this is a really famous painting by a German artist, Paul Klee, that Walter Benjamin wrote about at length. And this is, it's called the New Angel and the Angel of History. And so at first, when Paul Klee was asked, it looks like, you know, the angel is looking forward, it's facing you. And Klee said, no, 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 this is an angel being blown backwards into the future by the wind of the past. So you can imagine you're kind of going like this, like, oh shit. But all innovation is this. Like, we don't see forward, we see backwards, right? And so we make all our new technologies do the work of the old. We don't really see what's possible. To that point, Edison, he invents the gramophone recording and all the things that follow, that I'm being live streamed somewhere. What he thought he was doing is he thought he was making an astonishing little doll that could speak. So this is the first innovation that Edison comes up with to use recording. He's like, well, we figured this out. He first thought it had something to do with office work, like you could dictate better with it. And then he's like, the first thing they tried to bring to market was this doll. And it was an absolute failure. Like, people were just creeped out by it, like this talking thing. It was super expensive. It was like any technology we now just dump on people without figuring out how to make it work. Really expensive, and it just fell apart right away. So you'd buy this for your little child, they'd start screaming and crying, and then it would break. So there's very few of these that work, that are left. But this is what he thought he was making. He didn't realize what it meant to record, to reproduce, what it meant to have a media industry, that there would be recording artists, that Kanye West would show up. He just thought creepy dolls. Do you guys know what this is? This is the first movie theater. So when Edison and his team, you know, they were one of the first developers. You know, all these things are developed in parallel. There's like 20 first light bulbs, 21st planes, 21st recording devices, 21st film. So the Edison version of film, they thought what people would do is you'd go to like your little nickel and dime store, and you'd put a coin in, and you'd just see something. And it would be this private experience that would just be about a discrete, beautiful moment. So they brought this to market. And they're like, we'll put this in all the stores across North America. They had no idea that what cinema was this immersive experience that was shared, you know, collectively. Obviously now cinema's become something closer to that, where we all sit with our little screens, but you know, that's just part of the sideways movement of everything. But so they had no idea what they were doing. This is another thing, like, where you imagine in this kind of product sense, you know what the thing you've got is. But since we go into the future looking backwards, we have no idea. We think we've got the perfect egg warming device as we're starting to flap up. You know, we think we've got wonderful dolls. So the last one is just this question of design, where we think designers come at the end of stuff. And you hear this all the time. I don't know how many people in the room are in the design side of things, where somebody's like, we figured out how to make like this really cool thing, and now we just need you to make it beautiful so it'll sell well. But if making is everywhere and ongoing, the question of design is everywhere. By that I mean design is, on one hand, the study of making, and making is everything from the Big Bang, us, this chair, to doing it is encompassed by it. So there's the research side and the engagement side, and that we have to think that idea of making as process that's continuous and ongoing means that how we think about design, how we think about beauty, how we think about creativity are sort of baseline things of reality. They're not extras. Like creativity is the underlying condition of reality. It's not something extra. So making is the underlying condition of reality. And beauty is when things cohere. It's not like something special, that some sauce. That flight works is where beauty begins. So I think, we have to imagine that there's an ethics to this, that if there's no position outside of making, which is so reality never stops, neither do we. So you can't imagine there's a pause. There's just ongoingness, and we're inserted in the middle of it. We have to care for making in a different way, because there's no off and on button. We're co-constructing reality every day. And I think, everything from climate change to whatever it might be should make us really aware of that. There's no passive position possible. So this is something that Heidegger says. He says that, care is the primordial structure of life. But it's not like care just for each other or for things, but it has to be care for this co-emergentness of qualities, of possibilities, of holding things together, of the multiplicity of worlds and properties. I think that needs to be kind of fundamental to any practice of innovation. All right, so really fast, you could put this all, for the sake of teaching it, into what we call the innovation design framework. So, if you look at and synthesize all sorts of environmental, ecological, historical, human, non-human practices, and overly abstract them, you could say, well, there's a process of assembling around a concern, an issue, a question. You figure out what it is. Then there's a type of foregoing or blocking, which we talked a lot about this morning with the skateboarding example, where you stop somebody from doing what they're trying to do, where you're like, we'll forego keeping eggs warm, and we'll see what happens. We'll forego sequestering toxins. And that opens up this space of experimentation, where you find new qualities by kind of fusing with things and following them. This is, again, I think, just to say really fast, where places like libraries really matter. Because you need to be a really good innovator and creative, you need to, in some sense, catalog all of this stuff, keep track of it, hold on to it. And so at some point, these experiments lead to a paradigmatic moment of whatever it might be. You've followed your drip, and you see this world of action as art. And now you stabilize that into a world, and you pay attention to it and you consult it. You in some sense are caring for this emergent world, whatever it might be, flight, painting. And so responsive design is coming in not to ask people what they want, but to figure out what does that world need to stay together, stabilize. And at that point, you can start to ideate, prototype, and make. But that all comes at the end. So you can sort of think of this is the classical idea of design. You come up with an idea, you make a prototype, you test it out a bunch of times, you make it, and then design thinking says, well, hang on a minute, we got to consult people. What do they need? What do they want? And then you ideate, prototype, and make. But what the argument is in fact, all of this stuff is what creativity is, what innovation is. These are really good problem-solving techniques, but they're not techniques of creativity or innovation. They're about something else. But they do fit inside a model of creativity. So it's not like they're wrong, but if you imagine that this is the story of how we do design or creativity, you've missed how it's part of a larger system, a larger set of processes. So I'm going to end there, and maybe we can sort of open it up to a kind of discussion part and go from there. But I think hopefully you guys get a sense that we really should take on innovation, creativity very differently than we do. And I say that not as an outsider, but like somebody, in an innovation center, in an entrepreneurship center, that's doing all the wrong things and trying to figure out how to do the right thing, rather than just like showing up like, hey, this is how it should be done. But it's very difficult to get from where we are to this. Okay. Questions?
What are some of the barriers that are not allowing us to get to the first part, that we jump right to the next, trying to ideate and trying to make something?
Well, ideating is really easy, and historically that's our tradition. Like, it's all about thinking. We're mind focused, so we've made infrastructures that do that really well. And then there are also things that are really easy to judge. So in sort of formats that need judging, like schools, like we can't judge your mud and grass pile. We just have to follow it. You can't judge Pollock's drip. You just have to follow it. So, and then you have no idea if it'll pay off. So, but if somebody needs to get graded, you're kind of stuck, because it could be, you give them their grade on December 11th, and on January 9th, they realize it has nothing to do with eggs and it's about flight. But it's too late. The class is over, they've moved on to the next thing. So I think we need frameworks and formats that are much looser. We need forms of judgment that are responsive, rather than like saying, well, we can know in advance the criteria to judge. Like, if you make something new, you also make new criteria. So it's, on one hand, universities are ideal because they're centers of research, but then as centers of teaching, that model of teaching has to really change. But I think the research side, for a long time has supported, in a way, the useless, and as much as our politicians hate that somebody got a grant to look at, why lemons smell a certain way or something, and it's, why would anyone pay for that? I think it matters. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you find any utility in sort of maybe the role binaries of things like innovation versus invention, or design versus art, right? And that sort of design is that realm of problem solving, art being that realm of pure creativity, and innovation being iteration off of things that already exist, and invention being that whole cloth new thing.
Yeah.
I mean, are you trying to challenge and collapse that, or do you see a different way of sort of framing that?
Yeah, I mean, to me there's like two answers. Like historically, you could trace it and see how art and design sort of were co-invented, and these divides between, like say, art and craft and useful and useless. Those are historical things that come from really the 1700s. I would just say we don't need them anymore. In a historical sense, it feels like to say, well, that's art and that's design because that's useful, but we don't actually know what useful is till after the fact. So to pre-designate people in one category or one practice isn't that interesting. And I think art as a category is now, I don't know, it feels, maybe I'm being cynical, but it's things for the 1%. And the most interesting creative stuff today, if you add art or not add the word art, it just doesn't matter. Like if you look at what Beyonce's up to, you just say it's music. You don't have to claim it as art. And it feels like art is now this very provincial thing that's forever trying to cannibalize its utility, off things that are far more interesting. So it's kind of, I think of art like the horse-drawn carriage. After the car came along, it didn't disappear. It's still wonderful, it's out there. But the car changed the entire ecosystem. And I think once you start thinking of invention, creativity in this larger sense, all of those terms feel like they get in the way. And so it's not like there's not astonishing whatever, but we don't need to keep calling it like that's design, that's art, this is useful, that's not useful. And one day, the things just float across it. Like one day it's a wing, the next day it's a musical instrument.
So you said that you have to kind of move away from utility, and I guess I want to push back on that a little bit, especially from your examples, right, from evolution and so on, where there is always a move towards utility, but the utility is always changing or being reevaluated. Yeah. And I think maybe that's what you're suggesting. So rather than saying, how useful could this thing be to, say, flying, you're thinking, well, if it's better for warming, then we'll go in that direction. But now it's better for something else, so let's move in that direction, and so on. So you're always, in order to follow a path that you're supposedly opening the door to, you need to have some sense of why you're going in a certain direction. So you can always change your direction if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I would only say that, like, value emerges afterwards. Like, so utility isn't a pre-existing measurement, like where we can say that's good or bad. But it's something that co-emerges with a world. Like you'd say that's how you work in that world now that it's there. And then the values, utility, we'll just say like how things work is a co-emergent product. But the part I would worry about in terms of innovation, creativity, is that we try to bring purpose from the previous world and keep its model of like ethics and meaning and utility for the next one. But in that other world, none of those things hold true. And so, I think we really have to believe in difference. Like that in one mode of being in the world, these are its values. In another, there's entirely different ones. There's different qualities, properties, sensorium, whatever. And we don't need one universal set of, template of anything. So utility is fine, just understand where it applies and how it emerges. that would be my thought on that.
It seems like you're describing essentially infinite universe of problems. And these problems are being gradually discovered by generating solutions not necessarily aimed at the original problems that they were supposed to be generated for. And it's like peeling the onion, right? So,
Yeah.
so there is that cycle that not necessarily, disregard the past, but just discover the problems that existed, like with your example with the wing.
Yeah.
All the mechanisms that didn't go forward basically could be discarded as useless by evolution, right? But eventually they solved the larger problem of locomotion that existed.
Yeah, I mean, so I just say first, this is a big debate about emergence, which is, between strong and weak emergence, which is to say, do these things all pre-exist? Like you're saying, there's a universe of problems, and we could, in a sense, solve them all. Or are these like co-emergent, genuinely co-emergent things that you couldn't know in advance? And I would argue the latter versus the former, so that there is no pre-existing universe of problems, but that it actually emerges through action and through doing. And if you rewind the clock of evolution and you start it again, with little bacteria, you wouldn't come up with necessarily wings or the type of wings we have, or people, or whatever it might be. But there is a big debate about this. If people are interested, sort of like strong, weak emergence, or is the space.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I have
Thanks.
to admit, though, I felt a sense of disappointment when we got to this slide, because I was like, really, is there an innovation design process? Really, did Jackson Pollock or the
Yeah.
And so I just wondered how you reconcile. It seems a little bit of a disconnect to me to have a process with sort of very diverse ways of getting to things. So
Absolutely. So I'd say two things to that this is a framework for teaching, to get people immersed in, or in a way to tune people away from the world of ideation into the world of doing. The second thing is you can, this is like a very shortened version, but you can take all of these parts apart and sort of re-scramble them and use them differently or individually. So, you can, in a sense, these exercises of foregoing or empathizing and consulting, you could just do that as a discrete thing, or you could join them differently. But I think this is, what's powerful about this is less to say objectively everything fits this, but that this is an effective tool for teaching today. So I didn't say that, and I really should. So this is just a pragmatic schemata. It's not, this isn't the truth that all innovation can fit into it. Though I would argue that you could see in almost all forms of innovation parts of this in different ways. But given where we are today in this kind of Neoplatonic, ideation-centric, disembodied, de-worlded model of creativity and innovation that's obsessively repeating this part, these are really powerful tools to get kids out of that. I don't know if that truly answers, because it is very much abstraction and circumscribing, and it's very true. There is no one way. There's not even many ways. There's a lot. It's much more ambiguous and difficult. But that said, there are ways to do these things that are effective. It's not like creativity's just anything.
What do you see the role or importance of serendipity? Recognizing.
I think huge. Like chance is fundamental. You know, so there's chance, like in the Pollock story. There's chance. You know, I think in evolutionary stories, chance is everywhere. Like it takes some silly dinosaur scrambling up a tree to fall out of it. And I think we can, you know, chance and, you know, all the artists who've used indeterminacy, like John Cage, and all of those are astonishing resources. Because you can figure out just by like stochastic processes all the possibilities of this. You know, but if you just stick to the ones you think are right, you have very few. But if you're like, well, you know, you just start knocking things around, it gets really interesting. And a good example is, we were talking about earlier, is El Bulli, the famous Spanish restaurant that developed molecular gastronomy. These guys, they close their restaurant for half the year and they go into this lab and they literally just, in a super methodical way, they work through every possible way of doing something. And it's literally like a type of chance, like let's do this and then do this and then do this and do this. There's no intention, and then they just record, document, and store all the emergent qualities and possibilities. Their one rule is like no meals are allowed. Like they don't make actual dishes. They just try and find qualities and processes. And then at the end of it, they figure out how that could be cohere. So yeah, chance is glorious. The more the better.
Teach students or work with students to recognize their assumption of the existing world and let them go and recognize serendipity.
It's hard because they've already gone to high school where they've learned that they exist and you know, I don't mean they, but we all exist and we're all really important. We all have great ideas, and it's just if everyone could get out of our way, you know, we would find our natural talent and truth, and it's somehow just inside us. So I think this is where like these processes are good, because you put people through a process and really astonishing outcomes happen, and then you can ask them at the end, like, did any of you guys see any of this coming? And you know, the answer is always no. Like we could never have imagined, and it's true. And I think that slowly loosens it up. Like, so if you give people lectures about this, it doesn't really help. It's all practice-based learning. And after the fact, you can sort of debrief people and point out that you thought creativity was this, and it was all about you, but now you realize that this thing happened. And you can't point to any person or any action that is the author. Then I think the more times people do this and the more times they see it's effective, then, you know, people start to fold parts of it into their practice. And
being interested, of course, in scholarly communication and the changes of libraries more being part of a generation of the knowledge versus the just storage of what's been already disseminated, how can we encourage innovators to think of the process as being key and document the process along the way and not be afeared of losing their intellectual property as a result, or not being, you know, how can that go for tenure promotion purposes?
Well, I don't know the last part. The first part, I mean, I think this is like the El Bulli example, which is so great, where these guys just obsessively document, like in the ongoingness. So in a way, it's not like they have a pre-existing library where they've got every cookbook, but they're making a library in their practice. And what that allows them to do is continuously re-abstract information and go, well, here's a pattern, here's a process, and then, define cooking a certain way and everything falls into a certain place, and then redefine it. And I think if you just do something once, like the way we teach innovation, like you work on your, say shoe design, we're working on our app design, and you guys are making this kick-ass game. It's like siloed. You don't see that there's patterns, there's structures, and that those could, move across disciplines or fields. That those are actually achievements. Those are innovations. And I think the more we can do that, in the way there's a kind of catalytic resource of emergent possibilities that are at the level of procedures, patterns, techniques, methodologies, and so in that way I don't think it's stealing anybody's, because you still have your kick-ass game. All we've taken is like, say, the process that you got there, and we could go, hey, you guys are stuck in your process, look at this process. We wouldn't even have to say it was to make a game, it's just a process, and maybe it's actually something else on a different level of abstraction. It's like, fuse that in there, or why didn't you guys think about this? And I think that way databases, like real-time sort of abstractions and pattern recognition is fundamental. It's not like an added luxury, but I'd say in a way we're screwed without it, because we're just working, in one-offs. I think you guys are all doing that, and like to innovate, you have to do that. And then you look at like, Edison's. If you go to his studio, it's a 3 or 4 story library is the biggest room, and it's collecting every annotation they made, every idea, every patent, every book they needed. It's the same with the Wright brothers. They like studied everything, and everything that, and then you tried to disprove it. Like, is that actually the angle of flight? And then what they didn't, they kept. And so they had this huge database they could draw on in real time. And so without libraries, you could argue it's very hard to genuinely be creative in this sort of real-time developing way.
Just wondering how much interaction you might have had with art education. It seems like an area that should be the most innovative and the most liberal tends to be, in some cases at least.
Oh, yeah.
You hear the term, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Where in an atmosphere where you would never expect to hear that.
Yeah.
Hear it frequently.
Yeah. I've taught for many years, on the art side of things in graduate art education, and the first thing I'd say is like most art is actually very, very conservative. Like, you're a painter, and so the space of innovation is narrowed to that. And the thing to say about that is like, I think for a lot of art, it's just not about creativity. It's about something else, and so that's fine. The problem is that artists, claim that mantle, that it is about creativity, it is about innovation. They should just, I think, bypass it and actually focus on what they're interested in, and stop saying those things, because there's nothing wrong with being interested in, say, symbolism or representation, and developing historical traditions and practices that you grow off and you're in dialogue with. But the idea that you have to be entirely unique, and then it turns out what you really mean is you're slightly different. It's like you're living in a sort of paradox you don't need to. Great art doesn't have to be completely unthought of previously. It just has to be a kind of difference that makes a difference within whatever it's about. You know, and so creativity is just, I think, something we need at some points, and at other points we don't really need it, and often we overvalue it. And I think in the arts that's really the case. And I mean, I'd say the other part of that, you know, Western art is really obsessed with expression, the self, and these things feel like so trivial today, you know, in a world that's, you know, ecosystemically different. We can't talk about the self. You know, once you realize that we're 90% bacteria, we're embedded in, you know, our effects will last for millions of years into the future, to think of the thing, the organism, as a human that's about expressing itself and finding itself in these classical 17th century ways is totally, I would just say, disastrous. You know, so the thing we're calling art education is still obsessed with that, and in my mind that's what's really troublesome. Any other thoughts or questions?
Okay, well, let's join in a round of applause for Dr. Kerr.
I should say really fast, I'm not a doctor, but I can doctor things really well. So,
We gave you an honorary doctor.
thank you so much.
And in appreciation, we have a certificate that showed that you are the 2016 Mayden Lecturer, so thank you for coming to town.
Thank you so
And
much.
For all of you, thank you for coming today, and we have a retreat outside. So please adjourn, and I'm sure Ian will be glad to answer additional questions as we munch.
Super.
Thank you.
And just really fast, if anybody's interested, I think you can get the PowerPoint. I'll send it to you, and there's like other materials I'd be happy to send along.
Do you have annotation for this somewhere that sort of explains what these boxes mean?
Yeah, I can, I've got like a whole bunch of crap.
Sweet.
If you-
That's scientific.
That's, yeah,